One, light is not just a physical thing. I mean, we know that our bodies need vitamin D, right? And we can get it by having our skin exposed to the sun. There's actually a condition, a disease called seasonal affective disorder. Everybody in the Northwest has it. That's why they're sad all of the time, but at least they make great music for us because of that. So, without having the sun, literally, it makes you depressed. Like, you need the sun to be happy. That's why we live in San Diego, amen? It's a real thing. Getting sun actually affects your emotional or spiritual health or mind in your brain, which is part of your body. It affects that and makes you happier. God's light, physical and spiritual, is good for your soul. So that's the first thing, that light's not just physical, but it's spiritual too, according to the verse we're looking at today. Here's the second thing 2 Corinthians 4:6 implies, that there is a darkness in our hearts that needs to be invaded by God's light. We live in a world where there's still darkness for like half the day at night when we sleep most of the times, and then there's times in our lives, times and seasons and occasions where we see and we experience spiritual darkness. We've sure had a lot of it in 2017 in our country, right? With so many shootings and racially different strife and sexual misconduct. It's there, and it's not just there like out there, but it's in here too, in us. Romans 1:21 says, when we don't know God, we don't love God and honor Him and give thanks to Him and live our lives for Him, that the result is that our hearts get darkened. They get darkened. The context of our 2 Corinthians 4 passage, meaning the context of the stuff that's said before and after the verse that we're looking at, it talks about this blindness that we have in our minds where we don't see the light of God's truth and believe it. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says this, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of God, the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. We need the light of Christ to shine into our hearts. And when He does that, it opens our eyes and it makes our hearts full of joy. One of my favorite Psalms in the Bible is Psalm 16:11, which says, you make known to me the path of life. So we're all living life and trying to find our way in life. God has the best path for you in your life. God makes known the path of life. In His presence, there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Living your life with God is a much happier life. That's where the joy that we long for is going to come from, following God's path. There's a fullness of joy. That's where I got the line for this sermon point from. In life, we experience many joys. And I think of, when you try to think of what is it to be full of joy. I think of a few occasions that come to my mind. I think of my wedding day over 16 and a half years ago, marrying my beautiful wife. I was full of joy that day. I think of the births of each of my daughters when they came out, and just seeing them and filled with so much joy, it just brought tears to my eyes. There's many occasions, there's times when we feel full of joy, right? You know what I'm talking about? When you felt full of joy, overflowing in joy. And I think that experience is a small snapshot of what God has promised for His people in eternity, for us in full, never ceasing, always increasing. This is the promise for God's people, that when we turn to God and when we look to God and we trust God, we walk with God, and in His light, there's this promise of the fullness of joy for us. Promises the fullness of a deep, long, satisfying joy. What God's joy does is it dispels the darkness and the sadness that enters into our hearts. It illuminates our inner life, and it drives out our fears. It drives away our guilt and our shame as we bask in the love of God's light. Hans Urs von Balthasar, he was this Catholic theologian who died about 20 years ago. He wrote this book called Love Alone is Credible. He says this, God interprets himself to man as love. He radiates love, which kindles the light of love in the heart of man, and it is precisely this light that allows man to perceive the absolute love. Insofar as we are his creatures, the seed of his love lies dormant within us as the image of God. But just as no child can be awakened to love without being loved, so too no human heart can come to an understanding of God without the free gift of his grace in the image of his Son. By looking into the light of Jesus as God's Son, we see the love of God for us. And that light, it floods our hearts with joy. And we rejoice. This is the joy that we need. It's the joy that we were created by God for, made for. It's the joy that we long for. And it truly can be found nowhere else except in the love of God shown to us through knowing Jesus. It's the light of joy for our souls. This is the promise of God for his people, fullness of joy. We experience it here and now in this time and life on earth in part. Those of us who look to Christ and trust in Christ and walk with Christ, and one day we'll experience it in full. Today, do you feel empty? Do you feel like your joy has been depleted or stolen away, and you need God's joy to enter in again? Maybe today, do you feel alone, unloved? You need the love of God's light to come in and renew your heart and fill you with his joy. What I want us to know today so much is that God has love for us. God has love for you. He wants to shine his light upon you in your life.